Do you remember the nursery rhyme song, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star? It's a sweet little song. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are, up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. We learned that song as kids, and we think about the tiny little stars we see twinkling above us in the night sky. Astronomers Jason and Julia Wright were singing this song to their kids one night when they thought, wait a minute, we're astronomers. We don't have to wonder what stars are. So they wrote a scientifically accurate version of the song. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, I know exactly what you are. Opaque ball of hot, dense gas, 1,000,000 times our planet's mass. Looking small because you're far, I know exactly what you are. They go on to include 20 verses about the science of stars and exactly what they are. Stars are enormous, but we've narrowed them down to the tiny specks of light we see in the sky. We do that with a lot of things. We make them smaller. Maybe we think making things smaller will help us understand more. Maybe it's about control. Maybe we just can't wrap our minds around some ideas, so we focus on smaller bits that we can explain. In the church, we've done this with salvation. We've made it into something small. I attended so many worship services growing up where the speaker closed the service by instructing us, every head bowed and every eye closed. I know that someone in this room needs to get saved tonight. You can pray this prayer with me. And he would proceed to offer a repeat after me prayer, guiding us to ask Jesus Christ into our hearts as our personal Lord and Savior, while the crowd sang 20 verses of Just As I Am. And that was it. Salvation was all about a moment, a decision, a very personal thing. So when we hear the psalmist say that salvation is at hand, this may be the picture we have in mind. The psalmist paints a broader picture. God will speak peace. God's glory may dwell in our land. Steadfast love and faithfulness will meet. Righteousness and peace will kiss each other. Faithfulness will spring up from the ground, and righteousness will look down from the sky. Dr. James L. Mays explains, salvation is portrayed as the dynamic activity of the characteristics of God. Steadfast love, faithfulness, righteousness, and peace. The psalm describes salvation as a dynamic process in which the character of God in all its fullness is at work. Professor J. Clinton McCann expands on this idea. Our text from Psalm 85 is a portrayal of the abundant life that God wills for all humankind in all times and in all places. So not only does it summon us to look for and pray for the abundant life that God wills, it also challenges us to work toward that abundant life for all. What has been made small and individually focused is really broad and communally focused. McCann goes on to say that salvation, biblically speaking, is the creation and or restoration of conditions that make life possible in all its fullness for all people. Now that's a broad picture. Why would we try to make it small? Well, we're just handing on the tradition we've received. From the early period of church history, we discover a tendency to reduce and narrow the broader understanding of salvation. To borrow imagery from Amos, we've used salvation as a plumb line. We've used our narrow view of salvation to judge people, to decide who is in and who is out. We've perpetuated the idea from church history that there is no salvation outside the church. And this is especially problematic when the church has ostracized people based on sexuality, race, class, and more. The church has drawn a hard line and, in a sense, denied salvation to those who aren't on a certain side of that line. Another way we've narrowed salvation throughout church history is by taking a dualistic approach, deciding to emphasize a separation of the body and soul. The soul and its destiny could be mediated by the church. I get it. When life is hard, circumstances and conditions are tough, and there are big problems with no clear answers, separating the physical and spiritual seems to be the only answer. When it feels like there's no hope for the physical world we live in, we imagine a spiritual world that is different and better. We hope to escape to that spiritual world someday in the future, and so we cling to the hope of someday to get us through the difficulties of this day. Salvation becomes the key to that someday. Salvation will help us escape. Now, in some ways, our psalm sounds like an escape. It's too good to be true. But our psalmist wasn't a stranger to tough days and overwhelming circumstances. The lectionary gives us the second half of Psalm 85 as our text for today, but we need to pay attention to the first half as well. The psalm begins as a prayer for restoration. There is remembering and naming what God has done in the past and pleading that God will work again. It feels like a difficult time for the psalmist. We hear, "Restore us again, O God of our salvation. Will you be angry with us forever? Will you prolong your anger to all generations? Will you not revive us again?" All of these questions and cries lead to verse 7. "Show us your steadfast love, O Lord, and grant us your salvation." We remember all these things you've done, all these ways you've been with us, evidence of your love and faithfulness. Show us again is what we're really saying. And isn't that how our faith journey is? Coming to God over and over again, not because God does everything we ask, or changes every situation, or shields us from the consequences of all our choices, but because we find in God this love and faithfulness that will not let us go. It is God's love and faithfulness that give us hope for salvation, for God's dream of wholeness for all. Since both of our texts this morning are from the Hebrew Testament, I wanted to look at them through the lens of Judaism and learn how people would have understood them in the context they were written. Rabbi Michael Strassfeld notes that social justice is a core value of Judaism. Our psalm talks about salvation and shalom, wholeness, well-being, fullness of life for all. The expansive idea of salvation is a call to work toward God's dream. Rabbi Strassfeld explains, on an action level, we might think about volunteering, donating money, working for political change. These three categories have Jewish equivalents. The first, volunteering, can be equated with acts of loving kindness, or more simply, hesed kindness. Hesed is a Hebrew word that's translated in our psalm as steadfast love. Acts of loving kindness include things like working in a soup kitchen or in a literacy program. They also can include interpersonal interactions. Helping my neighbor with a task may not seem like an act of social justice, but it is an act of kindness. Donating money and working towards systemic change share the same Hebrew root word. This word, zedekah, or zedek, is also in our psalm, translated as righteousness. Rabbi Strassfeld notes that the Hebrew suggests that we help those in need not just out of the goodness of our hearts, but because justice requires it. In Judaism, helping others is something that is required. It is not voluntary. And this is why the term social justice as a translation of zedek or zedekah may better capture Judaism's attitude than compassion or concern. It's a matter of justice rather than just being nice. There's a core expression in Jewish tradition that all Jews are responsible for each other. I love this idea, as hard as it may be. I think it gets at the idea of salvation. We are responsible for each other. We care for each other. We accompany each other along the way. What would it mean for people on the margins to feel that society is paying attention to their needs, accompanying them, rather than ignoring them? Even if we can't solve the big problems of our world, we can at least convey that we are paying attention, that we care. We come back to God's dream of salvation over and over again, not because we're seeing it unfold around us all the time, or because we're hitting the mark of caring for each other well, not because it even feels possible much of the time, but because it's a beautiful dream, a vision that gives us hope and purpose and direction. Meanwhile, in Amos, there's a vision of a plumb line. Now, most scholars agree that plumb line isn't what the text is trying to say, but it's the translation we most often see. Whatever the term actually means, it seems to represent a kind of judgment, a measuring, a standard. Now, we have different standards for measurements these days. Often we judge restaurants or hotels or products by reviews. A 5-star review is great. A 1-star review, not so much. Author and illustrator Amber Scher published a book based on 1-star reviews of national parks. Of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, one review said, subpar scenery. Of Grand Canyon National Park, a reviewer said, a hole, a very, very large hole. Of Bryce Canyon National Park in Utah, a reviewer said, too orange, too spiky. And maybe my favorite, of Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, one disappointed reviewer said, didn't even get to touch lava. I don't know what the standard of judgment is for these reviewers, but the national parks are just missing the mark. In Amos, God speaks of a standard, a measuring, a judgment. The judgment feels harsh. And Rector Stephen Edmondson explains that we must mark the faithfulness at the heart of this passage, or we entirely misinterpret God's use of law, God's judgment. If we're thinking about the law as a plumb line, it's fundamentally constructive, used for building up. God's standard, God's measure is steadfast love, is justice, is wholeness for all of creation. When we miss that mark, God calls us back, calls us to build together toward God's dream of salvation. Yes, the judgment that Amos pronounces feels harsh. And the priest Amaziah thinks it's much too harsh. He says that the land is not able to bear all of Amos's words. I wonder what words we are unable to bear. Amaziah feels that the judgment is too much. And I wonder what we do when we hear words or judgments that feel like too much. Statistics about hunger, poverty, climate change, or homelessness, it's too much. Devastating diagnoses, conflict within our families, division and hatred, it's too much. We might want these facts and troubles to go away. Amaziah certainly wants Amos and his message to go away. But Amos cannot, will not go away. He feels this strong sense of calling. He says, I was a herdsman, a dresser of sycamore trees, and God called me to this. Amos works in agriculture. He tends and nurtures, and God calls him to tend and nurture in a new way. What is it that we cannot bear and in turn cannot go away from? Caroline and Dwayne Purvis were astounded by the number of kids in Auburn City schools who struggle with food insecurity. They began the Auburn Sustenance Project to provide meals and snacks during school breaks for students who depend on free and reduced meals at school. What began as a one-time service project has grown to provide food for kids at all 9 elementary schools within Auburn City Schools. Brittany Stillwell is a minister in Little Rock, Arkansas. Frustrated about the foster care system in her state, she decided to do something about it. She went through hours and hours of training, home visits, and certifications to become a foster parent and care for children who need a safe and loving place to stay. What is it that we cannot bear and in turn cannot go away from? The vision of salvation in Psalm 85 sounds like good news, and sometimes that vision may sound like too much. We see the division around us. We feel the weight and angst of big global issues. We also feel the heaviness of our own personal burdens and needs. The vision of Psalm 85, God's dream for the world, feels like too much to hope for, an impossible dream. And yet, God calls us to tend this dream, to nurture this vision. Psalm 85 paints a picture of salvation. Artist John August Swanson paints a picture of Psalm 85. His rendering is printed on the back of the bulletin this morning. You'll notice bright colors in the sky and on the earth. People are working together, plowing, sowing seeds, feeding animals, and sharing the goodness of the land. They accompany each other, each doing their part, sharing responsibility for all. If you look closely, you can see some of the words of the psalm scattered throughout the painting. It's a panorama of a landscape of abundance, of people working the land and sharing with each other. It's a beautiful interpretation of the psalm. One of Swanson's inspirations for the painting was the song De Colores. It's a Spanish folk song, a sweet little song, maybe as familiar to some as Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. It says, all the colors, when the sunlight shines out through a rift in the cloud and it showers. All the colors, as a rainbow appears when a storm cloud is touched by the sun. All the colors abound for the whole world around and for everyone under the sun. All the colors of people who smile and shake hands and say hello. All the colors, yes, the colors of people who know that their freedom is won. All the colors abound for the whole world around and for everyone under the sun. This little folk song became the anthem of the United Farm Workers movement. This song for the cause took on new meaning in light of the migrant workers who worked harsh conditions to grow and harvest crops in the United States. At the end of their union meetings, everyone would stand with arms crossed in front, holding hands with the people next to them. They would sing about all the colors of the people who know that their freedom is won, and they would shout, "Sí, se puede," yes, we can. I wonder if salvation looks like joining together, even when we're unsure, even when we're overwhelmed, even when it feels like the odds are against us, and saying together, yes, we can. We can accompany each other. We can care about each other and feel responsible for friends and strangers. We can do acts of loving kindness and work for justice in big and small ways. Individually, we can't fix everything, but salvation calls us beyond individualism. We can do our small part as we join collectively in God's expansive dream of salvation. Salvation is at hand. Amen.